Great. Annabelle, can you see the responses as well, or am I the only one who can see the responses?
I can see them.
Okay, great. Then I will just let you read those out and I will mute myself.
Okay, hello everybody who has joined. I think there's still a few people joining, but if you haven't filled out the poll yet, please do so. I can see the responses. Around a third of the people here read regular updates about COP29, and a third of the people attended in person. There's also a few folks who, didn't follow the conference much and are looking forward to learning more about it at this event. And some virtual participants as well. So if you haven't filled out the poll, it'd be lovely for you to do so, and we can kind of get a feel for where everyone is in terms of their COP29 engagement and knowledge. We're just going to get started in a second. I think we're going to start sharing the slides pretty soon. Amazing. The poll hasn't moved in a bit, so I think everyone has kind of finished filling it out. All right, I think we're good to get started. So, hello everybody. Welcome to this event. What happened at COP29? Like the title suggests, we're going to be talking about what actually took place at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, from the perspective of youth. And youth delegates who were there on the ground, who were, tracking various different topics and tracking different policies. I'm Annabelle. I'm one of the co-leads of the COP29 project team with ClimaTalk. And if we go to the next slide, I'll briefly go over the agenda. We already did the starting poll. Dan, the other co-lead, is going to go over some organizational introductions before we dive into a really quick explainer of what COP29 was as an event. And then go into some deep dives of topics that our panelists tracked. So different I guess, policy tracking and different topics that were covered. And then all of the participants, you'll also get a chance to ask questions during our open Q&A time. So if you have any questions or any questions come up while you're listening to any of the panelists speak, make sure to jot it down or save it for the open Q&A. And then finally, we'll just have some closing remarks and ending poll. So next slide, please. Amazing. So, like I said, my name is Annabelle. I'll also be moderating this panel. And then we have a range of lovely speakers who will get the chance to introduce themselves later on, but you can kind of quickly glance over the screen and see a lot of their involvement in different roles at COP29. I think we can dive into the organizational introduction. So I'll give it to Dan to introduce Climate Talk.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. So yeah, ClimaTalk is one of the two organisations hosting this event. We were founded back in 2020 by our amazing CEO, Emma, And our main aim is to demystify climate policy, helping young people understand what's going on in climate negotiations and empowering young people to fight for climate action in these formal negotiation spaces. So we try to make climate policy accessible, digestible, and actionable for young people. We have produced a huge amount of content thanks to our more than 100 volunteers who are spread all across the world on every inhabited continent and in over 30 countries. We have published over 500 scientifically referenced articles covering a variety of key climate policy areas and spanning from covering COP and the UNFCCC more generally to looking into policy under the European Union. And we also have projects running to help people select climate-focused university courses and to find climate internships. Our COP project has been running since COP26 and has reported from 4 COPs as well as 2 intersessional conferences. These are called the subsidiary bodies, or SBs, which are held in June each year in Germany. We've published over 450 pieces of COP content, including at this COP a variety of fact sheets and youth guides, as well as an ABCs of climate COPs, which we update each year for COP. You can follow these QR codes to our website and social media accounts. We post regularly on Instagram and LinkedIn, and we also have a great range of resources on our website for you to go and explore. So the other co-host of this event is ChangemakerXchange. So they are, like ClimaTalk, an organization focused on helping young people get involved in climate policy and climate negotiations, as well as negotiations on a range of other key issues in the world. They found that through their research that over a third of young change makers, so young people who are keen to find solutions to planetary crises, over a third of these young people are focused on climate change. So it's clearly an immensely important issue and one that's growing in importance, with an increase of 20% in the number of young people focused on climate change in just the last couple of years. But many of these young people struggle with addressing these issues and struggle with juggling their work, often voluntary work in climate policy, with a lack of financial security, with a range of other responsibilities, whether that's work, study, or personal responsibilities, and lack the contacts and support networks to help them make a difference. So ChangemakerXchange do focus on trying to support young people and empowering them to take action. This is done primarily through their Changemakers for the Planet project, which helps connect young people and delivers capacity building and community building workshops to support them in making a difference. This covers not just climate change, but also key elements of other interlinked planetary crises, including pollution on both land and in the sea and in the air, as well as the biodiversity crisis, which, as we know, and I'm sure we will touch on later, is very, very closely interlinked to climate change as an issue. ChangemakerXchange are registered observers to the UN and have attended COPs with a number of delegates, focusing on a range of issues from finance to adaptation, loss and damage, and issues surrounding gender and climate change and indigenous rights. You can find more information via their website and also the changemakersfortheplanet.org website here.
Amazing. So I'll just give a really brief intro into what COP is and kind of what happened very, very briefly at COP29. So or the Conference of Party, is the highest decision-making body, and it enables countries to access progress, negotiate agreements, and set climate targets. So one of these most notable climate targets, for instance, during the Paris Agreement, which was COP21 in 2015, so approaching 10 years now, countries aimed to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And I think this is still one of the most notable outcomes out of COP that is most well known. So following the Paris Agreement to limit global warming, COPs have been kind of focusing on ratifying the agreed upon mechanisms and kind of going back to this goal and referencing this goal for all of the future COPs as well. So they might not have as conclusive outcomes as these previous landmarks. Like everyone, I think, has heard of the Paris Agreement before. We can go to the next slide. So the end result or the ultimate goal of COP is to formally adopt climate change agreements and commitments. So again, there have been some successes, the Paris Agreement being one, or the Glasgow Climate Pact of COP26, but not all COPs have notable outcomes. For example, COP17 and COP15 were crippled by tensions between negotiating parties. We'll see later too. The host country can really influence the outcome of COP. And results can really dramatically vary year to year, considering the success depends on the current, I guess, political and social economic climate of things. We can go to the next slide. So to kind of lay the road to COP29, each COP is embedded in a wider social and political context, and COP29 again was hosted by Azerbaijan in Baku. Um, Overwhelmingly, this was called the finance COP, right? This was supposed to be the COP where everyone got together and really like honed in on a number or an amount of money that was committed to climate action, right? It was also called a truce COP, and there was a 1 month call for a global ceasefire during the conference. Updated national plans were also a really big, I think, core to COP29. Countries were supposed to submit their updated national plans every 5 years post 2020, and they're supposed to have a ratcheting up mechanism, which means that goals are supposed to get more and more ambitious than previous goals that have been made. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on carbon markets is also going to be discussed later more in detail, but essentially looking at what a UN-backed international carbon market might look like and what are some downfalls there. And then besides the, I guess, call for a 1 month global ceasefire, there were also 13 other presidential initiatives, so 14 in total. And some of the broad topics that Azerbaijan kind of focused on were things like green energy corridors and zones, clean hydrogen, green energy storage, and sustainable tourism. And then finally, the NCQG, which will also be talked about more in detail. But essentially the new collective quantified goal and the $300 billion that was pledged. You can go to the next slide. So quickly go over what COP29 actually was like, right? Like what was attending it like and what happened. And I think the closing plenary was a really monumental moment during the conference. And if you haven't read Dan's, I guess, statement and summary of the closing plenary, it'd be really good and helpful to do so. But essentially, the last meeting of the plenary session is marked by different closing speeches from delegates. They can, express their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the course of discussions. And the entire conference is declared closed after receiving all of the reports submitted and taking all of the decisions that had to be. So this started at 8 p.m. and it was delayed from 3 p.m. And it also ended around 5 a.m. So just massive, massive delay and I guess like dragging on. One of the most significant items of concern that was discussed during this closing plenary was Article 6 on the carbon markets, the global campaign to demand climate justice. So the DCJ put out a statement actually during this closing plenary, and they said that COP29, had basically adopted very dangerous rules on carbon markets, and it seemed like developed countries effectively abandoned global efforts to prevent a total climate collapse. So very, very strong words and emotions during this event. There was also a fractured nature of a lot of the negotiations, given that different parties, delegates, alliances of different states, and negotiators had walked out earlier that day after not being heard fully. And there was an overall rapid or rush nature of agreements being adopted. Not all parties agreed to things. Paragraphs had been deleted in some texts. The COP29 presidency had been accused of stifling objections and essentially bringing down the gavel before all objections had been heard. Many were reminiscing COP28. There was kind of this sentiment that, oh, both of these places are petrostates, but at least Dubai tried was something that was commonly heard. And a lot of folks are looking towards COP30 in Brazil with more hope. So just a very, very, very brief overview. And in terms of the logistics of attending COP, what was being on the ground like? There were a lot of issues with things like food, right? Like mislabeling of the food, the price of food, as well as just, a very big, I guess, arena to navigate as a delegate, running from one place to the next, as well as technical difficulties. So myself and other youth observers, for example, couldn't make it into certain negotiation rooms, and so we would go into overflow rooms where we were trying to watch these negotiations being live streamed, but because of technical difficulties, it was really hard to follow some of the negotiations we attended, right? Like screens were cutting in and out, audio was cutting in and out, and I think overall there was quite a chaotic nature to a lot of COP29. But we can move on first. Onto panelist introduction. So again, I'm Annabelle. I was the co-lead of the COP29 team for Climate Talk, and on the ground delegate for COP29. And I also was on the ground for COP28 in Dubai last year. I'll pass it off to Daniel, and if everyone could really just quickly introduce their name, their role at COP, and any other COPs they might have attended. So Daniel, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Annabelle. So yes, so alongside Annabelle, I was one of ClimaTalk's COP29 project co-leads this year. So I was an in-person delegate at SP60, that's the Intersessional Conference in Germany back in June, and I was coordinating our virtual delegation during COP29 this year. So I think we had somewhere around 15, 16 people attending the conference virtually from a variety of different time zones. So that made the late night plenary even more fun.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniel. Mila, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Mila Sirichenko. I'm a member of on-ground delegation of ClimaTalk for COP29. I was there for 2 weeks and I participated before at COP27 and SB58. And yeah, we'll be speaking on Truth, COP, and ACE. Thank you.
Amazing. Shreya?
Hi, I also attended with the ClimaTalk in-person delegation for week 2 of COP29, and I was tracking food security and agriculture, and that was my first COP.
Amazing. Thank you. Muka, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name is Mukam Tetelenu, and I was part of the Zambian delegate as Party Overflow for COP29. I've been attending COP since COP26.
Amazing. And Jenny?
Hi everyone. I attended COP first at COP27 with an NGO Concern Worldwide, mainly tracking loss and damage, and then I became the Climate Youth Delegate for Ireland for SB58, COP28, and SB60. So then changed and started tracking Article 6 because there was no one else in Ireland tracking that. So began to follow there and kind of became obsessed from there, and was tracking it virtually with the Climate Talk then for COP29. And working on an online course on COP29 with the University of Edinburgh. So busy 2 weeks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. If we can start resharing the slides again, we'll now be moving into the panel portion. So we've prepared a few questions that target what each panelist tracked in the topics that they're most knowledgeable about in terms of COP29. Sorry, could we get the slides again for the topic? Okay. Amazing. So we'll just jump right in. Our first panelist will be Dan. And again, he was tracking the NCQG, which was one of the really hot topics at COP29. So Dan, what is the NCQG and why is it so important at this COP in particular?
So the NCQG stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. It's a bit of a mouthful. So going back to 2009 at COP15, developed countries, who are called Annex 1 parties as part of the UNFCCC, pledged to give $100 billion each year to developing countries to support climate action. That never happened. They never quite got around to fulfilling that goal, despite the quite large number of years that have elapsed since then. So as part of the Paris Agreement, it was suggested primarily by developing countries, that a new goal should be designed to try and encourage more action, encourage the provision of more finance by developed countries, and to scale it up to meet the needs of the worsening climate crisis. So the key focus of this COP was to end a sort of 2-year work program that was started in Glasgow at COP26. It's been a very fractious environment at times, and it did finally reach a conclusion, but certainly not one that everyone was happy with at COP29. Anna, but I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. Amazing. What has been decided thus far, and why have developing countries as well as many activists and NGOs called the number a joke? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. So the final decision on the NCQG that was made at the closing plenary was that developed countries would be providing $300 billion per year to developing countries, at least until 2030. That was quite a way short of what developing countries wanted, which was about $1.3 trillion per year. So significantly less than the figure that was anticipated. The Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC suggests that finance needs are to fulfill the commitments that countries have made under the Paris Agreement are around $500 billion per year, at least for the next five or so years. So this was a bit of a letdown as far as many developing countries were concerned. Developed countries had pushed over the past couple of years to expand the contributor base for the NCQG. So what they wanted was that instead of just developed countries providing finance, was that some developing countries who had the capacity, who had become wealthier since the original UNFCCC convention was signed in 1992, they thought that these countries could potentially contribute. So this group that they were aiming at here are often called the like-minded developing countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and India. So to top up this $300 billion that will be given by the developed countries, any developing countries who are willing to, as well as the private sector, have been invited to volunteer to provide finance. So there's no legal obligation on them to do so, but to try and raise this extra $1 trillion that was being requested, they've asked for these voluntary contributions, which has been incredibly controversial, but from a developing country's perspective, was better than any legal requirement for them to provide finance.
Amazing. That's super insightful. And what happened in the final hours of negotiations? What is being referred to when we talk about the quote unquote compromise solution to the Baku to Belém roadmap?
Yes, so one of the key parts of the NCQG and how it's going to progress going forward is a Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. So the aim is by COP30 in Belém next year, and realistically it will take longer than that. They want to scale up the finance. They want to go from $300 billion of commitments up to $1.3 trillion of commitments each year. COP29's negotiations were slow. A lot of the time, the first week or so was almost entirely dedicated to shortening the draft text. It started somewhere around 60 pages after the June conference, went down to 20, then shot back up to 35, and ended up, I think, 5-6 pages long. So there was a lot of different views were discussed and then subsequently streamlined and removed. But for that first week, very little actual substantive progress was made. A lot of it had to be crammed into just the final hours, and most of it wasn't open to observers. So unfortunately for quite a bit of it, ClimaTalk and ChangemakerXchange as well wouldn't have been able to follow anything closely. It was happening behind closed doors or in informal settings, which is often called corridor diplomacy, where party delegates will be meeting up just randomly in a corridor or just in a quiet room to try and hash things out and find a compromise.
Amazing. That's super insightful. Thank you so much, Dan. Was there anything else in terms of, I guess, the discussions or disagreements at COP29 that you wanted to mention?
I think one thing that just sort of throughout the year, really following the NCQG, and certainly at COP as well, was that there was a real difference in how countries wanted to prioritize the finance from the NCQG. So developed countries and also the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, and some of the least developed countries group, the LDCs, were keen for the finance to be directed to either the most vulnerable countries, so that would be small islands and the least developed countries, or to countries which were engaged in low carbon development, or perhaps some combination of the two. This was opposed by a variety of parties, including the like-minded developing countries who I mentioned earlier. There's probably still going to be some discussion around this. It was in the final decision, countries were urged to use the finance from the NCQG to engage in low carbon development, in sustainable development, but that isn't a legal requirement. It's an expectation, but parties will be very keen to try and avoid any of this finance being put to unsustainable use.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was super insightful and such a topic that has so much depth to it and so much detail. So if you have any questions, don't forget to note them down for our open Q&A later. But without further ado, we'll be moving on to Jenny, who will be talking about Article 6. So another, I guess, very expected major outcome of COP29. Jenny, just to kick things off, what exactly is Article 6? Where does it come from and what does it mean?
Sure. So, Article 6 is an article of the Paris Agreement that kind of deals with market mechanisms. So it comes from at the Kyoto Protocol in 1992. There was the Clean Development Mechanism created. So it's it all sounds really confusing with lots of terms thrown around, but it essentially creates a situation where developed countries are able to pay for projects in developing countries and do this because it might be a cheaper option for them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a developing country than in their own. And then they can use the emission reductions from the projects that they're doing as part of their own nationally determined contributions. So I think that's kind of why when at COP28 and SB58, when I started hearing more about Article 6, I couldn't help but follow it because I was like, wait a second, this has been happening since 1992 and no one's talking about it. So I think it's good that it got more visibility at COP this year and more people are talking about it and kind of have an awareness that it's happening. And because I think it's just a type of carbon colonialism that kind of goes under the radar quite a bit.
Amazing. And to kind of talk a bit more about the actual logistics of this article, what is the difference between the sub-articles of Article 6? A lot of people will hear Article 6.2, Article 6.4, Article 6.8. What are all of these different things?
Yeah, so they're the main three articles that kind of get talked about with Article 6 negotiations. So Article 6.2 covers state-to-state agreements, so bilaterals. So an example of this would be one of the first ever 6.2 agreements was between Switzerland and Thailand, where Switzerland paid for hydrogen-powered buses in Bangkok in Thailand. And then they were able to use the emission reductions that were generated by this as an ITMO, it's called. So it's an internationally transferred mitigation outcome. They don't like to make any of it easy. It's all big mouthfuls. So then they were able to use that as part of Switzerland's nationally determined contribution. So that's 6.2. And then 6.4 is an international mechanism that kind of oversees carbon trading as a whole. So yeah, a multilateral mechanism. And then Article 6.8 is for non-market mechanisms and kind of just covers anything non-market, but it's quite interesting because Article 6.2 and 6.4, neither of these articles mention the word market, even though they essentially create a carbon market. So then you have to use 6.8 saying non-market mechanisms to then decipher that 6.2 and 6.4 are creating markets, because it's just like one of these things where in the Paris Agreement, for example, like they don't mention fossil fuels and all these different kind of really tricky not saying certain words and saying certain words situations comes up in Article 6.
And you mentioned earlier kind of the long-going nature of these negotiations. Why has it been so difficult, do you think, to reach an agreement?
I think it's been particularly difficult because there's so many different views on how a carbon market should look, and there's not enough clear regulations, then a lot of kind of spin-offs and things are happening. So there's a voluntary carbon market where there's a lot of people acting in it now, and a lot of fraudulent projects get reported on quite often because projects that aren't actually reducing emissions are being kind of used to create carbon credits and to create profits for companies, and companies able to use we're carbon neutral and claim that they've offset their emissions through using Article 6. So I mean, it's been 10 years almost since the Paris Agreement, so 10 years of that, but the concept of carbon trading began in 1992. So it's really been going on a really but with I think this year being the most kind of significant outcome in it, because at COP28 there was no decision on Article 6 because countries were deadlocked over a number of issues. So it's kind of good that there's a decision, but I think you quoted it at the beginning of the talk that people were kind of saying it's quite a dangerous thing to be regulated, and there's a lot of civil society criticism for the kind of use of carbon markets as a way of kind of maybe neglecting other finance flows. And as Dan pointed out as well in the NCQG, there's like private sector contributions being considered as part of the overall climate finance. And that's kind of what's happening with carbon markets too.
Amazing. And at COP29 this year, what happened on day one? Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So on day one, the presidency, kind of in the same style as at COP28, the first day saw the Loss and Damage Fund being operationalized. A decision was put out on Article 6.4, which was really contentious. Just given the follow-up from COP28, there being no decision. And then at SB60, there was again a little bit of deadlock. And then there were intercessionals. So it was just quite unexpected that 6.4 would just be decided on the first day without the proper processes happening and negotiations happening. So that decision was put out, but it was negotiated on then afterwards. But I suppose it just kind of sets quite a challenging precedent for the carbon market negotiations, because it was kind of, the presidency trying to push something through to get a quick and easy win, but maybe not giving too much thought to the repercussions and things as they kind of put out certain text.
So yeah, just very concerning overall. But was there anything else that was decided at COP29?
Yeah, so on articles, I'll kind of break it down between 6.4 and 6.2 because they're the kind of main areas that I was tracking with ClimaTalk. So under 6.2, there's been a lot more prescription on what should be involved in authorization of carbon credits. So that's really useful in terms of people like in the industry kind of practicing now. There's been letters of authorization happening for a long time, but without a lot of guidance from that UNFCCC level from the Secretariat and stuff. So there's now actual decision text on that, which is good. And there's also now in the decision, there's supposed to be annual kind of automated consistency checks. And these are essentially just going to be like a public platform where these authorization kind of documents and things will be publicly available for anyone to scrutinize and stuff. So that's hopefully going to improve transparency and then therefore integrity of the market. But I think again, relying on public shaming is quite a lenient type of mechanism to enforce this. So it's kind of concerning there. And then in 6.4, just the mechanism established. Another thing that was kind of problematic with this, they just put in a sentence saying that, the knowledge, science, and practice of Indigenous peoples will be considered in the expert panels and things that they'll be doing for 6.4. But again, it's kind of this fails to recognize that a lot of Indigenous knowledge can't be shared in this way and put onto a panel and really formalized. So the national registrants have created under 6.4. Like there's, so lots of things have come out of this, and there has been a lot of development in the area in terms of kind of progressing along carbon markets, but still that kind of climate justice lens is still, kind of questioning their legitimacy always.
And with so many, I guess, like concerns and developments, but also like that absence of the climate justice lens, what is the way forward now, or what is your personal interpretation of what happened?
So I think the way forward now is just to really keep doing checks and balances on all of the different parties who will be involved in putting up their information on these public platforms, and to make sure that these public platforms are made in a timely manner. And I think something that kind of comes to mind when thinking about it was if anyone's interested in the area, there's a really good podcast that was filmed between Patrick Greenfield from The Guardian, who's been quite vocal and critical about carbon markets, on the Carbon Exposure Project it was. And he in the interview kind of says, like the interviewer was basically saying to this guy Patrick, the journalist, why aren't you telling positive stories about carbon markets? Because if you're just constantly reporting bad things about them, then they won't work. But if we all work together and everyone makes them into something more legitimate and fixes the integrity issues that we're seeing, then they can be a really good thing, and they can stimulate finance flows to people that need that finance where maybe the formal climate finance is failing. But in response to this, I think he kind of just says, a journalist's job is not to like be a fan of something or be promoting it. It's just to say what happens. So I think his stance is quite interesting and kind of the way to go with it, that we just have to rely on the actual market actors to be the ones improving things and like fixing all of these fraudulent kind of projects happening and all this, and then journalists can report on good things happening if they are happening. So yeah, just not really relying too much on the media and scrutiny to be the thing that saves carbon markets, and just for all the actors involved to really push for environmental integrity and real transparency in their own projects, so that then the media scrutiny can be an addition rather than the sole thing that's keeping them accountable. Sorry, such a long answer for a short question.
No, that's such an interesting, just interesting insights to it. And thank you so much for sharing that podcast as well. A good resource for all of our listeners.
I'll drop a link of it in the chat now.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you so much again for sharing, Jenny. Our next panelist is Muka, who will be talking about gender and youth. And gender and youth, from even before COP29 started, we saw was very, I guess, criticized in terms of not including gender and youth. We saw with, the COP29 committee that was introduced initially, that there were 0 women present, for example. And so Muka will be giving more insights into that. I guess just to kick things off, how visible was the lacking representation of women for you at COP29?
Thank you very much, Anna, for that question. I think just starting from representation itself, the UN obviously did report that we had about 40% of women who had registered to attend COP, and I think about 35% attended COP. Which in comparison to last year was just 1% increase, meaning that we are not doing so much in terms of making sure that women are participating. But even in that participation, we don't have so many women in negotiating rooms, and which is very visible because even speaking from the Global South, where I come from, most of the heads or leads that are leading these negotiations are actually men, and most of the women are in the background. So I think representation then starts from there. How well were we represented? And some might argue actually to say, well, if we had like 40% of women registering to come to COP, then this is like the most balanced COP that we've ever had. But if you think about it, I think the numbers don't really match up to now. So representation at that level of women was at that level. And then when it comes to youth, yes, we have so many pushing for their young people to attend these COPs, and many organizations, stakeholders wanting young people to come to COP. But the question is how substantial is their participation, and what are they really participating in when they come to these COPs? Are they just, moving around their pavilions or having conversations, discussions behind the pavilions, and or actually being in these negotiating rooms? So those are some of the questions that we really need to ask. But in terms of youth participation, the increase is there in terms of young people actually coming to these COP meetings. But then the question still remains, how well are we participating, and what kind of participation is there for young people? So I think it also starts from the accreditation process, how many governments are actually accrediting young people to be, part of their delegations. Most young people are given, obviously, observer or any other badges that they would find for them. So these are really the conversations that we should be having when it comes to the inclusion of youth and women at COPs.
Amazing. Thank you so much. You already mentioned kind of the 1% increase, but were there any other I guess, changes in comparison to previous COPs you may have attended or tracked, that may have been specific to COP29 in Baku?
Sorry, can you just say that again? My line was breaking.
Oh, sorry. So you mentioned kind of that 1% increase in, I guess, like women participating, as well as, there may have been more youth on the ground, but that doesn't actually translate into more negotiating power from youth, right? Were there any other changes in comparison to previous COPs or COP28 that were specific to COP29 in terms of gender and youth?
I think like from the participation level, obviously it was more youth inclusive. When we look at parties, most of them have actually claimed to having youth and women being the center of their participation and always including them in what they're doing. So I think on that level of participation, it is really good. But then I think it's the same thing over and over again from my own observation. I think we're still leaving the youth behind in terms of where they should be and what kind of participation they should be holding at these COPs. So the difference really hasn't been that much. But maybe I can talk a little bit about the gender itself. I think some of the wins when it comes to gender has been that obviously we know about the Lima work program. And during COP29, this was highly pronounced and there was an extension of this Lima program to 10 years more. And I think it should be a celebration in a way, but still we should question it because yes, we are celebrating, but we also need to do a stock take in terms of what could have happened between 2014 when this was actually, started up to now. And this extension, what does it mean for women? Obviously, the ideas behind that are to make sure that there's inclusion in decision making where it is gender. Women are participating fully and women are given, the ability to be part of the policy decision making processes, especially where they are coming from in their different countries. And so this could be a win for the gender division, but then we still need to track and check because some of the things that are lacking in here is that we don't have a clear roadmap. Even when we talk about the 300 billion that was pledged, there's no clear roadmap in terms of how much or what women benefit from there or what youth will benefit from there. So yes, so in terms of the wins, I think that's one thing that I would come out of, the gender negotiations from.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I already see some really insightful questions popping up in response to what has been said so far. So amazing work to all the panelists so far. Was there anything else on a policy level related to gender that you kind of want to touch on that happened at COP29?
I think when it comes to policy, the biggest that I've already touched on was the Lima work plan that was achieved in that manner. And I think it's just about really countries coming on board and seeing how they can actually integrate it. Coming from the global south, it's very, big in a sense because the effects of climate change are really visible when it comes to women and youth. And a continent that's grappling with droughts, a continent that's grappling with, floods and all those things. It's the women in our communities, our small communities that have suffered the most when it comes to climate change because they are caregivers. So they're the ones that are making sure that households are running. And so when there's any disaster that happens in our context, these are the most affected ones. So now the question is, how can our governments make sure that even from policy level, from COP to their governments, how are they making sure that there's implementation of, some of these mechanisms that they are coming up with and that they are signing to, at meetings like COP. So that on that aspect, I think we are still lacking coordination in terms of how well we make these plans to benefit women, especially women who are in rural areas who do not have access to most of this information that a few women are privileged to have. So yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for touching on that. The intersectionality piece, right? How gender is affected differently based on geographical region, based on socioeconomic standing as well. Earlier, you kind of mentioned how youth and children were represented at COP, their lack of power in the negotiation room, for example, or their presence in the pavilions. Were there any other examples of successful versus unsuccessful engagement?
I think maybe we could talk about maybe some of the successful engagements when it comes to youths. So we could also look at it maybe at a positive eye when it comes to them hosting, engagement meetings, especially on Youth Day. I think a lot of youth were engaged in their different sections, hosting meetings, talking about their work, amplifying their work and the things that they're doing in their different countries. I think that is really a win because there was a lot of that happening in different pavilions where that day was really dedicated youth and making sure that youth's voices were really, heard and amplified. So I think for me, that was really, really something that was notable. And also the different, meetings apart from the main negotiating rooms that were happening in the different side rooms. There were so many meetings that were also happening on a day that was dedicated to women. I think I did attend a lot of sessions that had a lot of insights on what women across the globe are working on when it comes to climate action and how it's affecting, their countries, their communities at that kind of level. So those also are some of the wins that we could also, celebrate when it comes to participation.
Amazing. Thank you so much for bringing up the positive things that did happen on the ground, and that might not have been, covered fully by media or overshadowed by all of the negative things happening on the ground in Baku. I guess last question before we round off. What do you hope to see at COP30 next year regarding youth and gender? What are your hopes in this area?
I think my hopes in this area is more meaningful participation. And also making sure that, we increase women in negotiating rooms, or be it women or youth. I'll give an example of my country, Zambia, that has been trying to do that in the sense that young people are also being part of the party, and are given accreditation as party or party overflow and things like that. And that has only worked because of the work that young people have been doing with their government in terms of ensuring that they're constantly working with their governments in amplifying their work when it comes to climate action, and their government becomes a stakeholder in the works that they're doing. So like that, it's very easy to come on board and help these young people in terms of that. But the other thing that I would like to see in terms of the Lima work plan that I talked about, I think it's about having also ensuring that we have clear goals, because the planning and everything else has been pushed to COP30, which is, 2025. And if we keep on pushing things like that, we will find that 10 years down the line, we haven't done anything because we were still negotiating on what text should work when it comes to such kind of a work plan. So my hope and wish is to see that, this is actually actualized and it is worked on, so that even as we're leaving COP30, parties have got a plan on how they're going to implement the Lima work plan in their different countries without having to drag for 2 weeks and talking about a text that won't, benefit anyone. Thank you.
Very good point. Yeah. Talking about things that will actually materialize and starting to see those things materialize instead of keep on focusing on, these broad frameworks. that might not always lead to tangible action. Thank you so much again, Muka, for sharing. That was super detailed and super in depth, and so needed for the conversation in climate action. We'll be moving to Shreya next. Shreya has done a lot of really amazing work on, food systems and things like that. And she also tracked agriculture and biodiversity. So I'll be passing the floor to Shreya with the first question. I guess following several delays over the past year, at COP29, the FAO again delayed the release of its global roadmap report. Can you speak to the progress that was made on food systems or agriculture at COP29 and what may have been missing?
Yeah, so to start off, the FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UNFCCC. And they have been continuously emphasizing that increased investment in agri-food systems is essential to addressing the climate crisis. So, to be frank, the amount of kind of climate finance that goes towards agriculture is around 4% at the moment. This is terrible because agri-foods contributes to an estimated 30 something percent of global greenhouse gas emissions, with 24 to 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions estimated to be attributed to animal agriculture alone. So it just feels, as somebody who does learn about this and kind of follows it myself, it feels kind of insane to be sat in rooms where this isn't being discussed and it's sort of how are we going to implement changes. It's more of a kind of talk point rather than an action point. And that's crazy because there's so much talk about fossil fuel phase out. Well, not in the actual negotiations, I guess, but in general and in civil society. But if we're not looking at agri-food systems, we simply cannot deal with the problem. So there's a huge, first of all, huge discrepancy between the 4% of climate finance and the 27-ish% of emissions caused by animal agriculture. To also put it into context, we currently on the planet have some 30 billion chickens alive right now. That's a crazy number that we have that many chickens on the planet every single day, considering from our global human population. So we are dramatically overproducing and overconsuming animal produce. But on the flip side, agriculture is one of the most vulnerable industries to climate change. And with agriculture responsible for maintaining global food security, it's really clear that we need dramatic food systems change. And given that the majority of the planet is actually not food secure, so having access to a healthy and appropriate diet is not something that we can say most of the world has access to now. That's a huge problem when we're considering the vulnerability of this industry to climate change with our growing global population. So if we neglect to shift our food systems, which is what we're currently doing, then the SDGs and the Paris Agreement can't be met. So out of the high-level meetings and events that I attended at COP, I constantly saw experts calling for increased investment in the area, which is good, and emphasis on the importance of addressing food systems in multilateral agreements, so aka the final text at COP, and also NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions. There's a push to encourage agriculture within these contributions from each country, which again are actually quite limited. And I currently see food systems as a really big talking point at COP, but like I said before, it's not a big action point. So interestingly, COP29 was the first ever COP to have a whole day dedicated to the theme of food security and agriculture. So that's a great first step. They're sort of pushing it to the forefront of conversation. But it did kind of feel like it was mostly just conversation. So in terms of positive outcomes, there was the launch of the Baku Harmonia Climate Initiative for Farmers. So this is aimed to come up with a collaborative online platform to for countries to collaborate with each other and for farmers to navigate existing programs for food systems change. With an emphasis on highlighting youth, women, and Indigenous voices, as well as smallhold farmers. So trying to reach the people that need to learn about this the most. However, the greatest challenge that I'm seeing is there's a gap between policy and projects like this and implementation. So do any of these suggestions even reach farmers? None of the ones that I've ever worked with in the UK. have ever really been well versed on how their industry is affecting climate change or even vulnerable to climate change. So it's a big talking point. And another tool that was unveiled at COP was the CAR tool. It was the Accelerating Climate Action in Agriculture, I think. That's the name of the tool. And I went to the launch of this tool, and again, they had extensive information on how to come up with action points and how to make them actionable. But then the implementation step was completely lacking, and people brought this up and they had no good answer for it, because how do you reach rural farmers? How do you even reach farmers on an industrial level? It's something that's not really being done at the moment, and there isn't really any positive solutions being put forwards. So that's unfortunately my stance on it.
Thank you so much for such a thorough answer. I really like the point you made about, food systems. Food systems touches everyone. People who live in very urban or dense cities, they might not think about biodiversity every day, or people who don't live in a coastal community might not think about the ocean every day. But food systems is definitely something that touches everybody. And what you said about, after these policies or after these plans or knowledge leaves the negotiation room, does it actually reach the ears of farmers? Do people who are actually at the center of our food systems, are they being educated on the effects of climate change, and are they being given the resources and tools to adjust their food systems to deal with climate change? So both very, very good points, and thank you so much. On moving on to biodiversity a bit, several of the speakers at COP29 noted the lack of initiatives on biodiversity, and they urged other delegates to look forward to COP30 instead next year, which is being held in Brazil. Do you think next year's COP30, will be a better environment for biodiversity goals and nature protection? And yeah, why or why not?
I actually do. So this is one area that I do have hope for. The expectations are high. Holding the conference in Belém, a city in or with access to the Amazon rainforest, should be a pretty dramatic way of highlighting the urgency of addressing deforestation, combined with indigenous rights and biodiversity loss. I also think Brazil's leadership right now is very interesting. So Marina Silva is the environmental and climate change minister, and she has a really good track record of environmentalism, and she stood up to big ag in the past to her own political detriment. And so President Lula, as well, of Brazil, has shown quite a strong commitment to advancing the biodiversity agenda. I'm pretty sure they've made quite a strong, in the 50s or 60%, kind of cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. I believe that's the commitment that Brazil is making, which is a very ambitious target. Something else that's really interesting is that Brazil is a country where, I mean, I think it's 75-ish% of their greenhouse gas emissions come directly from agriculture and land use. And it's 90%, I think, of their methane emissions are attributed to agriculture as well. So it's a really interesting country where that's their primary kind of area of having to shift things. And again, agriculture and land use is very much intrinsically linked with biodiversity. And so I think Brazil is going to be a very, very interesting area for these discussions to be brought up. And I think that agriculture will be moved to the forefront because of this. But at the same time, the COP process is not entirely dependent on the host country, right? So trying to get all parties to agree to anything at all will always be a mammoth task, especially something that is kind of new to the mainstream side of things. But it is clear how the more recent selection of host countries has not helped this process and hasn't kind of helped any of these issues sort of be moved to the kind of forefront.
Thank you so much for bringing
but it will depend on whether Brazil can, yeah. Sorry, no, just that it will depend on how Brazil and other international parties can bridge these gaps together.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sorry, my internet is lagging a little bit. But yeah, very good point. It's hopeful to see Brazil be more ambitious in a lot of these regards, because the host country definitely does have influence, as we've seen in the past couple of COPs. But again, it's always, a challenge or an art almost, getting all countries on board with something and making sure that no community or no country is left behind. So thank you so much for sharing all of those insights, Shreya. Our next panelist who will be speaking is Mila, and she'll be speaking about ACE as well as how COP29 was labeled a truce COP. So I guess we can kind of kick things off. And Mila has a lot of experiences in both of these regards, but again, just to go back to this idea of a truce COP, besides being called a finance COP, which COP29 overwhelmingly was known as, COP29 was also labeled as a truce COP with a call for a 1 month ceasefire. And the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Republic of Azerbaijan, who is also the chief negotiator of COP29, had said that this was not only to promote peace, but also because military activities around the globe are the source of 5 to 6% of global emissions, right? So a lot of youth and NGOs could kind of call it a bit ironic to see all of these, potential discussions or pledges being made, but at the same time, so much ongoing just conflict in this world. So, Mila, can you speak a bit about the intersections of climate change and militarism?
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for excellent moderation, Annabelle. So, from my personal perspective, Truce Corp should have been or could have been a nice initiative, and Azerbaijan was promoting it in the beginning of COP and prior to COP29, but unfortunately, it has not been the most successful initiative. I have some internal information that UN and several parties were hesitant to support this initiative since this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which only recently has ended, and there are lots of humanitarian issues connected to that. But largely now the military missions are overlooked by UNFCCC and IPCC as well. So UNFCCC doesn't require or they ask countries to submit their military missions on voluntary basis, but it is not happening. And the same, therefore, IPCC cannot really calculate how much countries are emit and how much emissions are connected to the military spending. And we were talking, I was on there also a bilateral meeting with IPCC vice president, where we asked her, Diana Urchforzets, we asked her directly whether IPCC can push for parties in UNFCCC to submit their military missions, and the answer was that IPCC is already doing a lot, and they don't have capacity or will, and she doesn't see it that it will happen. And we as youth or civil society need to push for military missions. Step back to the truce COP. So as we know that, this COP should have been in Eastern Europe, but Russia was blocking all European Union states, or countries like Moldova, for example, as well. And then Armenia, Azerbaijan, they were also blocking each other until Armenia decided to give a green light to COP in Azerbaijan for exchange of 30 Armenian prisoners of war. So that's how COP in Azerbaijan was agreed on. And in general, we cannot, of course, see conflicts and climate crisis as two separate bubbles. But unfortunately, in UNFCCC text and Paris Agreement text, wars and how much climate crisis is interconnected to military conflicts is not discussed at all. So this is, of course, a big issue that we as civil society also need to push on. Basically, the situation now is that the wealthiest 23 countries spend 30 times as much of their militaries on their militaries than on climate finance. Some other numbers is that US has allocated almost 18 billions in military aid to Israel in the last 12 months. And this is 1 time more than it promised to the loss and damage fund at COP29. Other numbers is that almost $800 billion were given to Russia for fossil fuels since full-scale invasion to Ukraine. And specifically, already more than $200 billion of dollars were spent by European Union to Russia to buy the fossil fuels. So it's like in February, it's going to be 3 years. And then these huge numbers were given like to the petrol states, but developed countries couldn't agree on 1.3 trillion of climate finance goal. So we can see the level of hypocrisy as well. And true COP didn't happen like only in the second week of COP. I have numbers from Ukraine because I'm also from Ukraine. So Russia fired more than 800 aviation bombs to Ukraine just in second week of COP. So 800 and more than almost 500 drones, these huge like killing machines to Ukraine, and more than 20 ballistic rockets. So like obviously no countries had agreed on the truce or peace, and some countries, again, like Russia, were using COP28 to promote their conservation efforts and like do greenwashing and use the UNFCCC space as a space for propaganda, how good some countries are. And even like to show, I can share the experience of my fellow Ukrainian activist. Basically, Russia was doing open event for conservation in one of the rooms, and my fellow activist with Party Overflow from Ukraine was denied the access based on the false claim that the room is full, even though then that the room was almost empty. And your UN security officer just didn't let them reach inside, which is completely against all UN international spaces that with an open event, it was not like party only. It was for everyone with an observer or like any badge you can visit. She was denied that with then no reason. And this is just outstanding. So, yeah, we know that there is this military mission gap, and it remains wide open, and UNFCCC fails to address it. Nobody is obliged to report the emissions, and even the so-called enhanced transparency framework, which where national inventory reports the details of country greenhouse gas emissions. And the deadline for submitting the new report is in the end of 2024, but it doesn't offer any enhanced transparency of the hidden emissions from the military as well. And all the conflicts around the globe are continuing to rise, like with humanitarian crisis in Yemen, Sudan, Gaza, war in Ukraine, and violence and instability continue to devastate millions, and impact of climate crisis and like refugees and their communities which are impacted by the military conflicts are one of the most vulnerable for the climate crisis impact. And we need rapid action and long-term solution, but unfortunately, UNFCCC fails to address it, and I don't see how it will happen actually in the future. So the situation doesn't look very promising.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Mila. War is something that is so foreign for a lot of people, but also such a reality for many, many others. And it's really hard to estimate the emissions or the environmental impact of that. So thanks for speaking on that, and also drawing some of the existing frameworks just to compare and contrast what is like actually happening at the ground in COP and what is actually happening in the rest of the world while COP is happening. Just for the sake of time, I just have a really, really quick and general question. Were there any, from a youth perspective, were there any updates to ACE at COP29, or is there any way ACE initiatives can better be integrated into national climate change strategies? And if you could briefly just define what ACE means as well.
So ACE, regarding the ACE, it's sorry, how they formulated. The use, global use on behalf of Yango was calling for the finance, because this is the biggest struggle for youth constituency, but also for other constituencies, and without like any finances, this is very hard for youth to be included in the UNFCCC space. It was not addressed, and of course, ACE is interconnected to new collective quantified goals, and since it has kind of failed, ACE is also not that successful. Yango was calling, and lots of like youth representative was calling for universal and use clause declaration, and also a declaration for youth negotiators and national delegations, of course, thanks to climate negotiators program, they brought like 100 delegates, youth delegates, as a part of their national delegations. So it has increased, but yeah, the youth tokenism is still on the plate, and youth washing. Like, I also came to Ukrainian party and asked like when we can have a youth delegate, and she said, and the representative said that actually we already have X name, and he's quite young, but it doesn't mean that he represents, of course, the interest of Ukrainian youth. So, but they use it as a cause to don't engage in any youth inclusion process. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for everything you shared, Mila. Very, very important to bring to the forefront of the COP29 discussion as well. Before we move on to open Q&A, so if you have, actually now would be a good chance if you have any questions on your mind. I see a few questions in the chat already, but if you had any other questions you wanted to ask, and if you have a specific panelist you want to direct it to, make sure you mention that as well in your message. But feel free to pop any questions into the chat, and I'll be referencing them later when I facilitate the Q&A. But before we quickly move on to that, I'm just going to speak a little bit about just transition and mitigation, and what is just transition, and what are the factors that are considered or need to be considered more when we're making climate goals. And so I'll just quickly speak about that for a bit, but and broadly, to make sure that nobody is left behind as we move to a transition. So indicating that there is going to be a change, that there needs to be this process of transformative change to a more green, more sustainable future, that in this process that we don't create or exacerbate more inequalities or other unintended social and economic harms. So it means taking action to mitigate these harms and creating opportunities that benefit all people and communities, and promoting sustainable development. So there is the Just Transition Work Program, and this was established at COP27 in 2022. And its modalities were adopted at COP28 last year. And so we can see the number of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that explicitly mention the words just transition is low. But it is also important to recognize that it is growing. So it jumped from 17% with 33 NDCs covering 59 countries in 2022 to 23% last year, so to 45 countries, 45 NDCs covering 71 countries. And so the work program on just transition pathways, it was created to help answer the question on how these discussions of just transitions at the multilateral level can be broad enough to support rapid decarbonization and climate resilient development at a global scale. And while these discussions are happening on a global scale, how can each country still define its unique needs and priorities? And so I guess one important point that came out of that is to, really champion people-centered transition pathways that put people's needs at the heart of all climate action. And I do think that people's needs and, the land's needs or the ocean needs, or what we perceive to be nature is actually very aligned and pretty identical, but just pushing for more dialogue on, I guess, the social side of things and making sure that our decision-making processes are as participatory as they can be, which we still have a long way to go. In terms of mitigation is referring to efforts to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions to slow climate change. So it's kind of about, I guess you could say, transforming like the energy or industry or land use systems now to ensure a sustainable future instead of actually, so yeah, kind of taking preventative measures and not waiting until these extreme weather events actually take place or the world actually crosses that certain temperature threshold. So it's the same thing as, wearing a life jacket before you get onto a boat, or basically just preventing or reducing the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So there was also progress on the work, the mitigation work program at COP29, although a text on mitigation was postponed to mid-2025, and it was also weakened by opposition from Saudi Arabia. So it's basically a non-binding process meant to enhance climate mitigation, and it was approved at the closing plenary. But the final version does fail to, mention last year's landmark decision at COP28 to shift away from fossil fuels, which was also included in earlier versions. So I think that's all I would say about it at the moment. And I'll be referencing the chat now to look at some of the questions folks have for the open Q&A for the 13 more minutes or so that we have left together. The first question I see is directed to Daniel. Daniel, can you tell us a bit more about the NCQG? Were there any details that you think are important for someone who this may be their first time hearing about the NCQG? And, is there anything they should read or Google later on to learn more about it?
Yeah, so I'm happy to elaborate a little bit and do feel free to, for any particular areas that you'd like me to touch on, do feel free to add those questions in the chat. From a reading material perspective, please do go and have a look at our website at ClimaTalk. We have published an NCQG policy fact sheet, as well as fact sheets on a lot of other topics ahead of COP, and we'll be publishing some more in the next few days, hopefully, summarizing what happened at COP. So the NCQG is mainly aimed at just trying to provide enough finance to take to implement measures that will keep us in line with the Paris Agreement's goals, and that key goal of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees. So the figures that the Standing Committee on Finance had suggested of sort of about $500 billion being needed in finance each year until 2030 was based on what countries have suggested they need in their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans. So these are submissions that each country makes every couple of years. The nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, we've mentioned a couple of times by people on the panel. And they are basically the mitigation actions, what parties are doing to reduce to reduce emissions to keep us from exceeding the 2-degree limit. Whereas national adaptation plans are more about how we adapt to living with the impacts of climate change that are already taking place, and some which the IPCC have suggested are locked in due to the warming that's already occurred. So the Standing Committee on Finance suggested about $500 billion was needed each year for these. As I mentioned before, only about $300 billion is actually pledged from developed countries. The rest of what was hoped to be 1.3 trillion, that was the key goal for a lot of developing countries, That is to be made up by further contributions, especially from the private sector, from multilateral development banks, and any voluntary contributions from developing countries. Developed countries had hoped that it would be mandatory for some developing countries, for emerging economies, I suppose you might call them, to contribute to the NCQG. Unfortunately for them, that isn't enormously possible within the scope of the UNFCCC. So back in 1992, when this process was set up, the convention defined developed countries as Annex 1 countries. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't really a mechanism for changing whether a country is included in Annex 1. So whilst the developed countries are contesting that perhaps China, perhaps Saudi Arabia might now count as sufficiently developed to contribute finance, I don't think there is a mechanism for this to change formally. So it has to be voluntary contributions from them, which is still more than those developing countries were willing to give. It wasn't a compromise many of them were happy with. There were a lot of very powerful statements after the closing plenary, including one from India, which I think was one of the first statements, who described the NCQG decision as an optical illusion and said that it had been stage managed by the COP presidency and the UNFCCC secretariat. Developing countries certainly weren't happy with the outcome, and there'll be a lot more discussion of how to scale up that finance over the next year.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. One question that can be posed to everybody, all of the panelists, given that we're all youth, there remains a lot of controversy surrounding climate conferences, including COP29, right? We see some delegations, some alliances, some organizations skipping out on COP29 for a variety of reasons. Why is it important for youth to participate, and is participating counterproductive? And I guess speaking to the counterproductive part a bit, I think I can guess that perhaps we're talking about the environmental impacts of attending the conference. And a lot of youth, including myself, this is something that we grapple with internally, right? Like, is the impact of me attending this conference outweighing the environmental impacts of me, flying there? With flying, this activity of like air travel, generating just so many emissions. So does anyone want to take the floor with this question first? Why is it important for youth to participate? Shreya?
I can start. I would say that as youth, we're one of the main stakeholders in the negotiations that are happening. And I know a lot of us do feel very conflicted about the kind of net benefit and actually the role of people going, especially when, I mean, we've some of us have been a bit negative about the outcomes, so it does make you think twice. But at the same time, these are where decisions are being made on our future. And so it's so important that the groups that these are affecting, whether that's youth, Indigenous peoples, that everybody is there in person and is able to check the process. Because if there weren't, there's always going to be lobbyists, fossil fuel lobbyists, big agricultural lobbyists. And this is the way that we can sort of work out what's happening and share it with other young people. So from my perspective, that's why it's important that young people are there and other groups that are extremely affected by what is happening. I'm sure other people have more extensive answers than that, though.
Thank you so much, Freya. Anybody else have anything to add? Why is it important for youth to be there? Muka, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yes, I can also just add on to say, just like Sherry has mentioned, I think as young people, we are currently, holding the biggest population, I would say, in the world. And this also trickles down to some of our countries as well, especially on the global south, where 60% of the population in Africa is actually youth. And most of the workforce that is being done is really dependent on the young people. So if the young people are not part of these, negotiations, policy decision making, it's very difficult for the older generation to actually think on our behalf and be able to bring out, issues that we want to bring out when we go into these negotiating rooms, and all the opinions that we have about the things that we would want to see change. In our different categories, and most of the times there's this notion where they talk about young people being the future leaders of tomorrow, when the world is happening now, and they're living in this current generation now where things are happening. So meaning that young people are not the leaders of tomorrow, but are actually leaders of today, because they're part of the processes of everything else that is happening in the world right now. So we don't want to wait for them to grow old, for them to be part of decision making. So I think that's one of the reasons that we should also be thinking about. And the fact is that these COP meetings will always be happening. So whether we make the decision consciously to go or not, we also have to balance in a way that we make sure that we're also participating.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Absolutely right. Youth are the biggest, population in the world. And if we abandon, these COP processes and these official processes until we do get old, that transformative systems change that needs to happen at these official processes is never going to happen. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Um, does anyone else want to speak about that? I think that might be the last question we have time for. Jenny, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, sorry. If you want to go to a different question, then that's no
No, go
problem.
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just to add to what Treya and Muka have said as well. I think, in terms of like when asking yourself the question, like, is it counterproductive to engage with COP and to go and to be there and stuff? I think, that really just benefits the people who are kind of in charge of these systems. For young people to just believe, oh, well, I can't do anything there if I'm there, like nothing's happening, it's just useless, which is a lot of that is true, and a lot of people come out of COPs and things really disappointed and so disheartened. But I think anytime that I've come away from a climate conference feeling that way, for the first week or two, I'm like, oh geez, like I should never go to that again. That was just terrible. But then I think you turn that anger and that upset into kind of passion and drive, and just need to use that to not really take a stance of political apathy when it comes to climate change. Because I think, people say, oh, you should be there, youth should be there because it's a future problem. But for so many young people in the world, it's, climate change has been impacting them for, decades now already. So I think it's just really important that, where as a young person, sometimes leaders and things will be more likely to listen to you because they're like, oh, you're a young person, and you might have some sort of like political weight in that way. I think it's we, while we're young and they might listen to us, it's a great time to be pushing and to keep challenging these kind of systems where, they want you to not care and to just say, oh, well, there's nothing I can do as an individual. But yeah, sorry, rant over.
No, thank you so much for sharing. I think this is really important to just like get firsthand perspectives on. This is something that is really hard to, I guess, verbalize and talk about at times. For all of the other questions in the chat about, what happened to the loss and damage funding, where does this leave global South countries, for example, or, just more specifics on, I think, the financial element of COP. There's a lot of existing resources out there. Emma has published or has popped a lot of lovely ones into the chat. And these are a lot easier to, I guess, read up on as well. So feel free to look into the chat for a few articles that have been linked or just stay updated with what Climate Talk will continue to publish and post in relation to COP29. We have 1 minute left together, and I'm hoping you all can fill out the post-COP event poll that should have popped up on your screen. Just a few short questions. We always want to be learning more about how we can form our events better to suit the needs of the youth who are attending them. So if you can just go ahead and fill that out, and feel free to just be honest with any feedback you might have. What other events or what type of work do you want to see done at COP30, for example? It's very heartening to see that a majority of people did find the event pretty useful, I would say. So that's very heartwarming for us and for all of the panelists to hear as well, who took the time out of their day to share with us. So thank you again to all of the panelists, and to Emma for putting this together. Emma, I'm not sure if you had any last thoughts or anything at all, but other than that, that brings our event to a close. So thank you so much all for joining today and taking some time out of your day to learn more about what happened at COP29.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I don't know if the person who asked about loss and damage is still here. I think about $730 million were pledged by the end of COP29 to the Loss and Damage Fund. And there were some decisions made logistically as well, including to locate the headquarters for it in the Philippines. So there was some talk on it, but it wasn't a key focus.
Thank you so much, Dan, for quickly answering that question in the chat. That's amazing.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I will be ending the recording now, if that's okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma.